So, the Pentium 4. It has a bit of a reputation. Hot, slow, inefficient. A dark era for Intel, for sure. And I'm not just following popular consensus. I was in the trenches back then. My family's first ever Windows computer was an Optiplex GX260. It had a 2.6 GHz Pentium 4, 512 megabytes of RAM, 80 gigabytes of mechanical storage, and ran good old Windows XP. We abused that poor machine. It stored our iTunes libraries, LimeWire downloads, and played thousands of hours of Flash games, pirated Halo CE, and Club Penguin. I remember at least 3 separate times it got overrun with viruses and needed to have Windows completely reinstalled.
Oh shit. It's Satan laughing at me now.
Did Microsoft Sam just say fuck you?
While that Pentium 4 computer got a lot of use, it wasn't exactly because it was the nicest machine to use. It was dog slow. I mean, it definitely had too little RAM and the hard drive must have been fragmented to hell, but I remember programs took like 20 seconds to start, Club Penguin and other Flash games dropped frames, and thanks to it lacking a dedicated GPU, stuff like Minecraft wouldn't even launch. Due to its sluggishness and my family being big, my dad had to buy another computer, which left the GX260 as the inferior machine to become pretty neglected. Even outside of my personal nostalgia, the Pentium 4 has a pretty interesting history. Around the turn of the millennium, Intel was finally starting to feel some competition in the x86 CPU market. AMD had beaten them to the 1 GHz frequency race with their Athlon CPUs, and feeling insecure about their smaller Hertz number, Intel developed the Pentium 4's NetBurst architecture as a direct response to AMD's success. Even after NetBurst started proving to be a dud, a lot of other important developments in CPU technology were happening. 64-bit processing, new instruction sets like SSE2, and hyperthreading to name a few, all of which the Pentium 4 got because it happened to be Intel's flagship CPU at the time. This has made the P4 a surprisingly long-lasting processor, at least as far as basic compatibility goes, making it capable of even booting into earlier versions of Windows 11. Given my personal experience with the Pentium 4 and its interesting spot in tech history, I really wanted to know, what exactly made the Pentium 4, and more specifically its NetBurst architecture, so slow? And despite its failings, how much use can you still get out of one today? Let's find out. Hi, welcome back. I'm Seth. I genuinely do have a lot of nostalgia for the Pentium 4. That old family machine I was talking about was sort of my tech stomping grounds, as slow as it was. I made my first ever YouTube videos on that machine with good old Windows Movie Maker and MS Paint. I even figured out how to use Adobe Flash 5, kind of, and made some pretty rough looking animations on them with my Sonic fan characters. Yes, I was a Giga Chad. Thank you very much. I also remember downloading the Dolphin emulator on that machine, hoping I could play Super Smash Bros. Brawl just by putting in my Wii disc, which was a DVD, into the CD-ROM drive. Oh, how far things have come. As time has passed and I've learned more about the Pentium 4, I've always wondered, what exactly made it so slow? We've heard that it was inefficient, that it pursued clock speed over instructions per clock, but what does that actually mean? What about the processor's specific design makes those statements true? Well, time for a quick computer science lesson. Gotta put my degree to use somehow. Don't worry, this will be interesting, I promise. So you might think of a CPU as a magic lightning rock that performs instructions sequentially. It takes in an instruction, completes it in its entirety, and only once it's finished does it move on to the next one. For the sake of easier programming, CPUs are designed to work as if this assumption is true, but it's not actually how most modern CPUs work internally. Think of a modern CPU more like an assembly line, in this case called a pipeline. This line has multiple stations, or stages, that code instructions move through. For simplicity's sake, we'll give this line 4 stages, called fetch, decode, execute, and write back. Don't worry, we don't need to actually know what these do. These stages all happen in parallel. For instance, if the first instruction in the pipeline is in the decode stage, that means the instruction behind it is in the fetch stage, and those are happening at the same time. This is a great way to design processors because it means we can use as much of the hardware at once as possible, rather than having the processor's execute hardware sit idle while it's waiting for decode to finish. In this setup, a clock cycle happens once every stage has completed its work and the whole assembly line can advance by 1. Perceptive viewers might notice that the clock speed of this system is limited by the slowest stage. We can only advance the whole system once the stage that takes the longest has finished. So how can we improve the speed of this whole system? Well, if we increase the number of stages by splitting the slower stages into more, simpler, still parallel stages, we can make it so these stages complete faster, and therefore each clock cycle is faster. And that's exactly what the Pentium 4 did. It increased the number of stages in its pipeline from the Pentium 3's 10 to 20, and later 31, and it's what allowed Intel to so drastically increase their CPU's clock speed. So now you're probably asking, okay, but what's the downside here? If more stages speed everything up, how could a processor with less stages perform better than one with more? The problem comes when the code coming in has multiple pathways, or branches. You see, oftentimes we don't actually know what instruction we need to load next into the pipeline. If the code has a branch, like an if statement, if x is true, do this, if x is false, do a different thing, we don't know what the next instruction will be until the instruction that figures out what x is completes. Rather than just doing nothing until x is resolved and wasting a whole bunch of time, modern processors will try to guess or predict which branch will be taken. If that prediction is correct, awesome, we just saved ourselves a bunch of time. But if the prediction is incorrect, we now have a lot of useless work in the pipeline that needs to be removed or flushed out. In a pipeline with fewer stages, there are fewer stages that need flushing, and we can get back to completing actually correct instructions sooner. If we have more stages, there are more stages that need flushing, and a bigger delay in getting back to completing correct instructions. And that, perhaps, is the Pentium 4's biggest problem. Intel did noticeably beef up the branch prediction capability of the Pentium 4 to try and avoid mispredictions as much as possible, but it just wasn't enough to overcome all of the penalties for inevitably missing a branch. On top of this, in order to keep each stage in the pipeline as simple as possible, the P4 actually wasn't capable of completely flushing those useless, mispredicted instructions from its pipeline. So useless work that would end up getting discarded anyway would just keep going through the system, wasting tons of power and by extension heat. Oof. NetBurst had a couple other interesting design choices. Okay, so let me quickly explain memory. Basically, there's a hierarchy of memory that a computer has. The fastest is registers, then slightly slower but still blazingly fast cache, then a bit slower RAM, and then really slow hard drive or SSD. The whole system is designed to try and keep whatever important data the CPU needs in as fast as memory as possible, so it doesn't have to waste time waiting on slow memory to give it what it needs. But we live in reality, and we can't have infinite cache, so sometimes we do just have to wait for slower memory to get back to us. NetBurst was designed such that sometimes, when the data it's looking for isn't in cache, instead of either just doing nothing and waiting while the data is fetched, or doing something more useful in the meantime, it would just attempt to execute the instructions again, over and over, until the memory it needed was there, spending even more power doing useless work. Finally, one quick last thing to blow your mind. Don't tell anyone, it's super duper secret, but CPUs also don't necessarily execute incoming instructions in order. I know, absolute insanity, but this is actually very useful for keeping that pipeline as full of useful work as possible, just as long as it doesn't confuse the programmer and everything still appears to have been executed in order at the end. The thing is, when we do this, we might have to keep track of a lot of different memory values. Depending on what instruction we're working on at what time, x might equal 1 or 3 or 5 or whatever, and the CPU needs to keep track of all of this. On a NetBurst CPU, if this type of memory wasn't stored in cache in the way it wanted, specifically if it was misaligned, Google memory alignment if you care, it would freak the fuck out. The CPU would need upwards of 165 cycles to resolve this issue, while other architectures can handle it in only a couple dozen. It is kind of an edge case, meaning this doesn't happen very often, but I thought it was worth mentioning because wow, is that a ridiculous amount of wasted cycles. So yeah, overall, NetBurst as an architecture is best characterized by its ability to completely faceplant when incoming code has many pathways, which is really common, and which don't fit nicely into its cache. Alright, CS lecture's over. Not too bad, right? Let me know in the comments if you were able to follow along. Anyway, theory is one thing. Let's see what that architecture actually looks like in real life. Meet Amy, my Dell Optiplex GX280. No, it's not my old family computer, that poor thing is lost to time, but it's pretty close, just barely newer. It features a single-core 3.2 GHz Pentium 4 HT, HT meaning it has hyperthreading, 4 gigs of RAM, 512 gigs of solid-state storage, a GTX 550 Ti, and previously a Sound Blaster X-Fi sound card, which actually died while I was making this video. The case has an interesting design. I like it a lot, but even with my nostalgia, I can agree that it's objectively weird. At least it stands out in a sea of towers that were either beige behemoths or a black box. It also opens in a clamshell, just like my Pentium 3 machine, which is cool and all if a little over-engineered, and it's also got this sort of flap loincloth looking thing covering the front I/O. Still have no idea why Dell decided to put that there. Oh god, Amy, put that away! Of course I have this machine running XP because why would you ever run anything else? But jokes aside, Pentium 4s really do seem most comfortable on XP, and the whole reason I keep this computer around is to run XP-era programs. But for the sake of this video and my own curiosity, I'm going to try Windows 7 and a couple Linux distros to see if they can squeeze a little bit more usability out of Amy here. Starting with XP, like I said, it runs like a dream. Thanks to this CPU having SSE2, we now have access to Supermium, which means we can do modern web browsing on a Chromium browser. No need to dig around the internet and find something obscure. I had no problems browsing Reddit, Facebook, and even YouTube opened with acceptable if sluggish speed. Some videos play on the main site. It's not consistent, but if I instead use my NVIDIA's host, I can watch whatever video I want with no issues, up to 720p if I'm in full screen. Kinda crazy, isn't it? The Pentium 4 650 in this machine came out in 2005, the same year that YouTube launched. Of course, Amy can do whatever office work you need. Both LibreOffice and Microsoft Office 2003 work great, and I managed to get an old version of GIMP to work on here too. I feel like there's this perception among computer power users that you need to have the newest version of whatever productivity software you use. That's not necessarily true. People made tons of awesome stuff in the mid-2000s with software like this, and it's just as capable of doing that now. Plus, you actually own the software, it doesn't need a subscription. Fuck Adobe. As for games, I was surprised old versions of Minecraft actually run pretty okay here. Yep, real Minecraft, not ClassiCube. I did have to use a custom launcher and install Optifine, but 1.4.7 here runs pretty well. Chunk loading bogs things down a bit, as expected. But other than that, we can get around 60 FPS. We can even turn on the graphics settings thanks to our 550 Ti. Amy will start to struggle to play AAA games from about the Xbox 360 era and onward, but games from the beginning of, or just before that period, stuff like Half-Life 2, Far Cry 1, and Elder Scrolls Oblivion, all run amazing, especially if you can find the original versions for Windows XP. Overall, I would call this machine, even on XP, pretty usable. It would definitely need way less tricks and workarounds than Rotor needed when that was my daily. Moving to Windows 7, it's a similar story, if a bit slower. Our SSD keeps the OS pretty snappy, but not without jumping to 100% CPU usage when literally anything is open. It does make my inner child happy to see Windows Aero running on a computer that looks like my old family PC, but that's just because we have a decent GPU in there. Our CPU is literally the lowest scoring thing on the Windows Experience Index, and it does feel that way. In a nutshell, you'll have more compatibility with Windows 7 on a machine like this, but you'll be sacrificing some performance at pretty much all times thanks to Windows 7's higher overhead. And I should mention that there's a lot more community projects and retro revival efforts targeting XP rather than 7, so if you're gonna run Windows on a machine like this, I'd probably just stick with XP. Now for Linux. I gotta say, Amy here is a big fan of Penguins, as am I. The first distro I tried was Anti-X. I knew I was gonna have to go with something performance-focused, and Anti-X seemed perfect. It's Debian-based with a lightweight desktop environment and still has 32-bit releases. And it runs great. I'm by no means a Linux wizard, though I do plan to switch my main desktop over once Valve figures out running VR games, but as far as I can tell, this is a snappy, feature-complete, if a bit streamlined, Linux experience. Firefox takes its time, but runs okay. Pale Moon is a great option if Firefox is too sluggish. Productivity software runs great, as does Super TuxKart. Steam didn't really want to install. It seems like it doesn't really like 32-bit OSs anymore. Unless your game has a specific Linux build, I'd just boot into Windows. The final OS I tried was Lubuntu. This felt like sort of a long shot. I had heard that though later Pentium 4s like this one did support 64-bit, it was pretty early for the tech and their implementation wasn't fully complete or something. I thought I was gonna have issues installing a now 64-bit only distro. But I didn't at all. It runs great. It installed much slower and boots slower than Anti-X does, but it feels pretty much just as snappy once the desktop is loaded. Also, this might just be a placebo, but it feels like Firefox runs faster on Lubuntu than Anti-X. I wonder if that's a 64-bit versus 32-bit thing. I only have 4 gigs of RAM, so I don't think it's getting access to more RAM or anything. In any case, Lubuntu also seems like a great choice. Might get you some more software compatibility than Anti-X. Speaking of which, just for shits and giggles, I installed Steam and tried running Morrowind through Proton. It actually ran. Poorly, but it ran. You might be able to play more games with Ubuntu than on Anti-X, but again, Windows is best for games on hardware this old. Overall, I'm actually really impressed with the Pentium 4. Given its notoriously bad design, I wasn't expecting to see it be so capable. It seems like the problems I had as a kid with my old machines were more so issues with limited RAM and hard drives being slow, rather than the Pentium 4 here being particularly slow. With the benefits of SSDs and, at least at one point, cheap RAM upgrades, old hardware like this can still shine, at least with software that's well designed and isn't spying on you or phoning home in the background. To me, the Pentium 4 stands out as a sort of landmark of CPU technology. Not because it was good, it sure as hell wasn't, but because we are just so advanced with CPU technology that Intel here could make an objectively poorly designed processor and still have it be capable of modern tasks 20 years later. Can you imagine trying to do your 2005 era tasks on hardware from 1985? Like, we are so ridiculously far ahead with CPU lithography and general design that a total lemon processor that spends a good chunk of its time doing nothing or repeating useless work will still stream video and browse the web 2 decades after it was released. And that's just the coolest fucking shit ever to me. With that said, if you're looking for an XP era machine to mess around with, just get a Core 2 Duo or Quad. The Pentium 4 is old enough now that it's starting to get more rare and get crowned with the vintage tax, so Core 2 stuff is going to be much easier to find, not to mention better performing. Maybe check out my Optiplex 745 video for more on that. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, getting close and personal with decades-old technology, consider liking or subscribing. I've got more videos just like this one in the works that you will like just as much. Anyway, that's all for now. Have a good one.